Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's presentation, Guardians of the Grassland, Antelope of Southern Africa, is brought to you by NatHab Expedition Leader Lorraine Doyle. Lorraine earned her honors degree in nursing in Bristol and worked as an intensive care sister for a decade in the UK before returning to her native Africa and becoming certified as a Big Five vehicle-based and walking guide. She founded her own training company, Africa Nature Training, in 2002, and has been sharing her expertise through guiding at the Mataquí Game Reserve and writing her column, The Wild Guide, in South African Travel Magazine since 2017. Born and raised in Zimbabwe, Lorraine combines her medical background with extensive guiding certifications and has explored numerous national parks across the USA, Botswana, South Africa, and Zimbabwe throughout her career. Wow, that sounds like an amazing past. Let's hear from her now. Lorraine, take it away.
Thanks very much, Rob, and thanks as always for the opportunity to present. So the presentation today is, as you said, on the antelope of Southern Africa. And I decided to do this topic because I think very much when people think about coming to Africa on a safari, they think very much about the Big Five. And I think there is just so much more to safari than the Big Five, the big predators. And I just wanted to highlight something of the antelope that we have and just the incredible diversity within Africa, within Southern Africa. And this is just a very, very small sample of a much, much bigger topic. So possibly at some point in the future, we can also look at some of the other species that I won't be able to cover today. So I think the first thing is the term antelope is quite a strange sounding term. And from the work that I've been able, the research that I've done, it appeared in English for the first time way back in the mid 14th century, so a long time ago. And it's said that it's derived from an old French word, which in turn came from medieval Latin and Byzantine Greek. And as with all things that go back that far, there's always the possibility that things have been lost in translation. But it kind of literally translates from beautiful eye, perhaps alluding to the animal's long eyelashes, or the fact that actually antelope do indeed have beautiful shiny eyes. But I think what that leads us to is that the, the term antelope is not a single taxonomic group. So this is not a scientific definition. It's really a word given to a number of groups of animals, all of which belong to the family Bovidae. And I've got a small cladogram here, really just to show the extensive difference, if you will, between all these different bovids. And as you can see, it includes amongst it bison, buffalo, cattle, as well as some of the animals that we would more broadly classify as antelope. And really, the groups that I'm going to even consider today are the tragophanes at the top. So those are the spiral horned antelope. The antelopini, so that's things like our springbok, the duikers, and little steenboks, impalas, and then lastly, some of the hippotrags, so your sable and your roan antelopes. So not looking at anything like your ibexes or your sheep. But as you can see, all of those are classified as bovids. And we are just pulling out, if you will, certain classifications of those creatures. Okay, so just a little bit of sort of really broad brushstroke history. And talking about even-toed ungulates. So ungulates are any animals that have a hoof. And even-toed essentially refers to something that has two toes for the most part. So if we were talking about something like a rhinoceros, we would say it was an odd-toed ungulate. So all of our deer and antelope species descend from a common ancestor that is estimated to have lived about 55 million years ago. So this is a long history going back. And estimated 91 antelope species. So a great number, a great diversity, most of which are native to Africa. And those are spread throughout about 30 genera. So one of the reasons that we have this incredible diversity, we need to take a little bit of a look back in history. So I think very often when we look at where we have animals and why they occur in the areas they occur, we tend not to look far enough back in time. But many of these distributions that we have today are linked to something that happened millennia ago. And as is the case with distribution and diversity of antelope, and the savanna habitat in Africa. So when we talk about a savanna habitat, we're talking about a habitat in which you have this coexistence of a woody layer, as in trees and shrubs, and a grass layer. So not enough trees to dominate, that creates forest, but not enough grass to be a complete grassland. So this combination of the two allows us to have a lot of different sources of food, for example. So we have browse in the form of woody material, and we have graze in the form of grass. And because of those diversities, we can then have this incredible suite of antelope. And if you look at what's happened in the last sort of 3 million years in Africa's history, you're having most of the extant species, so most of the species alive today, evolving. And during these times when you had this expansion and contraction, often associated with kind of glacial periods and interglacial periods, you were left with refugia, so little refuges, if you will, in isolated pockets. And as a result of that, you then have a driving force for the type of diversification that we see in the antelope species that we're talking about. So that's just a real high level kind of broad brushstrokes of kind of antelope in Africa. Now, one of the things that people often ask about is, well, what is the difference between an antelope and a deer? And so in Africa, we don't have any deer species. All of our species, native species, are antelope. And one of the major differences that you can see in this picture, so the one with these sort of curly spiral horns, which are unbranched, that is typical of antelope. And the one that shows this very sort of branched looking structure, that is typical of deer. And so the one set on antelope we refer to as horns, and the one on deer we refer to as antlers. And not only is one branched and versus unbranched, but structurally they are very different. So in the case of horns on an antelope, that bone is attached to the skull and it's covered in a protective keratin sheath. They continue to grow throughout the animal's life, and they are never shed. So if, for example, a horn gets broken, which does sometimes happen when males are fighting, that is then broken. It's not going to grow back, and it's gone, essentially. Whereas obviously from a North American, European perspective, people are well acquainted with deer that shed their antlers, after the mating season and then regrow them again the following year. So it really is a very sort of different structure, and possibly in all instances, this may be linked to things like sexual selection, defense from predators. So if you think about Africa, where you've got a large number of predators which are eating these antelope, because many of the antelope are part of their major food source, having something like horns as a form of defense, as well as for male-male combat, possible having sexual selection criteria associated with it, opposed with something like deer in Europe and North America. Still obviously predation pressure, but possibly having these antlers which can be shed are giving you more of a sort of a male-male combat, sexual selection type of reason for having those ornamentations. So just moving on to their dentition. So this is actually a skull of a small African antelope called a sumi. And the only reason for really including it was just to show you some of the dentition that they have, including this incredibly large gap. So if you can see between where the back teeth on both upper and lower jaw end, you've then got a very large gap, and with no teeth on the upper jaw, and then only teeth on the lower jaw, and that gap is actually known as the diastema, and it essentially facilitates efficient plant processing because the tongue can actually manipulate the food, move it onto the grinding molars on both upper and lower jaw, where it can grind it down, and essentially they can then continuously chew and grind this tough fibrous vegetation, which is essentially their entire diet. So that's what's given rise to this kind of quite an unusual looking jaw structure. What's also quite interesting here, and not linked to dentition at all, but these very large eye sockets on the sides of the head. And if you think about being particularly a prey species, you really need a wide field of vision, and having eyes on the sides of your head facilitates that, as opposed to a predator, which essentially requires the ability to gauge distance and therefore needs binocular vision, which allows it to then have a much better depth of field, which is necessary when you're trying to catch something. So even in that skull structure, quite significant differences between something like an antelope or anything that is primarily a herbivore and something that's a carnivore. So also linked into that, if we think about their diets, is the digestive system. And I said right in the beginning that all these bovids are what we call ruminants. And I'm sure this picture is probably not that unfamiliar to many people from biology classes, but it's referring to the four-chambered stomach of your ruminants. So ruminants are animals that chew the cud. And this, I guess the one that most people are well acquainted with would be cattle. But all of the antelope species um, that we are speaking about tonight, or sorry, today, um, are ruminants, and so by definition chew the cud. And the reason for having these four chambers to the stomach is that these animals are now consuming a plant-based material, and that plant-based material has got cellulose in the cell walls. Now, they are unable to absorb the nutrients required from that cellulose, from that plant matter, without breaking it down quite substantially. And so the way that it's done is that it passes into the first stomach, the reticulum, and there it's mixed with this whole cocktail of bacteria and other microorganisms, which begin to start fermenting and processing this very fibrous plant material. And then it will come back, they will chew it, it will pass into the next chamber, and so on, until it gets to the abomasum. And that's the equivalent of our stomach. So there you have acid digestion taking place, and the final kind of ability to break down food so that it can then be absorbed into the animal's system through it passing into the small intestine. And so really necessary for these animals to be able to do this in order to get maximum nutrition from this fairly low nutritive material that they are consuming. So I've kind of split it up into three categories. So the first, small antelope, going to medium-sized antelope, and then to larger antelope. Again, this is very much an artificial construct, but it just helps in terms of sort of grouping what we're talking about. So the first little antelope that I've got pictures of here are a little antelope called steenbok. And this is a very widely spread antelope across the southern African subregion and also up a little bit into East Africa. I've got a distribution map in the next slide, which I'll show you. But they often are found in these sort of lightly wooded grasslands slash savannas, and often in relatively open territory. So the one with the little very straight horns is the male, and the one without the horns is the female. So the females of the species never ever develop horns, and the males, when they reach sexual maturity, will develop these horns. So these are quite sought after prey species for things like leopard. Caracal will also take them, as will some reptiles such as pythons. And if you have juveniles, they'll also sometimes be taken by things like jackal. It would probably be, even though it's a relatively small antelope, as an adult, it would probably be too big for a jackal. But the juveniles would probably be capable of being taken. So these little guys are primarily browsers. So when we talk about browse versus graze, when we talk about browse, we're talking about things that are broad-leaved. So whether that be forbs, whether it be plants, that flowering plants or plants from woody material, shrubs, things like that. So that's their primary food source. When we talk about animals being grazers, they are focusing almost entirely on grass, so fine-leaved monocotyledonous plants. So they also, at this time of year, there's quite a few flowering plants. And just recently, I finished a safari in South Africa, and we were watching these little steenbok picking up a lot of the flowers that are dropping from the varying trees and consuming those. Very high in energy, so nutrient rich. And obviously, when you're this small, you need to be able to get a lot of nutrient rich food to sustain you. These little guys are territorial, in fact, quite highly territorial. So they will defend a little territory. They do that by having little dung middens, which they mark. And they will quite fiercely defend that territory. I think the next photo after this one will show you just a little bit of an interaction between two males. But this is just to show you sort of the broad distribution. So you're looking at countries here like Namibia, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and tiny little bit into the kind of southern portion of Zambia, and then parts of East Africa that you find this little antelope. This was just an interesting interaction that I witnessed a couple of trips ago between a very young male, which is the one that's kind of running away, and the older male. And I think this was probably a young male coming in trying to see whether or not, he could mate with a female or just coming into the territory. But the older male was having absolutely none of it. And shortly after I managed to snap this photograph, the bigger male, just chased this little guy completely out of sight, and quite aggressively. Those little horns are like little daggers. So yeah, it was probably pretty wise that the younger one disappeared. So the next antelope, sort of in the small category, is a common, sometimes referred to as a gray duiker. And duikers are very numerous as a species. I think there's about 22 species that have been recorded. So this particular one, as I say, occurs in sort of southern and up into sort of more east and central Africa. So it's quite widely spread. The gray color is more pronounced in the males. So if you have a look here, the one again bearing the horns is the male. The female does not have horns. And as you can see here, this one female, this was actually in Hwange National Park. She had picked up, there was some leaves that were dropping from the trees, and she had been picking these up and had started eating them. The name duiker actually derives from an Afrikaans word which means diver, and that's to do with their way of moving through the bush. So it takes an awful lot of photographs to get one that's even vaguely in focus of these antelope, because the minute they see you, they quite literally start diving from side to side in a sort of a zigzag pattern to get away and go through the bush. And so that was how this name originated. We do get a number of other species in southern Africa, and we get a smaller one in the moister eastern portion of the country called a red duiker, and also a very, very small antelope called a blue duiker. But the common, or the gray, is by far the most widely spread. And as you can see from this distribution map, it really does cover a wide swathe of the continent, essentially south of the Sahara, with some of the densely tropical areas missing because in not necessarily the correct habitat for them. Then just a little bit about these guys. So this is a klipspringer. Again, another word derived from the Afrikaans language. Klip meaning rock, springer, jump. So these are rock-dwelling antelope. I guess the equivalent would be sort of mountain goats. And they have these tiny little hooves, which they miraculously somehow are able to jump from rock to rock to rock. Incredibly agile. Also, highly territorial little antelope. And you can just see below the eye on these photographs, sort of a dark area. And that's actually known as a preorbital gland. And they use that for territorial markings. So what they will do is they will find a grass stalk or a little twig, and they'll actually push it put partially into that gland and then leave a secretion on the twig or the piece of grass as a territorial marking. They also do use small middens, but they have a slightly different number of ways of marking their territory. I think one of the things we forget as humans, because our sense of smell is not particularly good, is the huge importance that smell plays in so many animals' day-to-day lives, that much of their communication is actually done through a sense of smell, through middens, dung middens, through territorial markings from things like glands, like this preorbital gland. They also have this incredible fur, the sort of grayish color, provides them with very good insulation for the environment in which they live, which is a really pretty harsh environment, and also helps with a fair amount of cushioning if they do happen to fall. But I think it's pretty rare that they actually ever miss their footing. Maybe when you've got a juvenile that's not hasn't quite learned to jump as agilely as its parents, it may slip. But for the most part, these little guys are quite capable of jumping also really quite far between rocks, and are really quite unique in terms of antelope, certainly in the southern African subregion, of filling this or living in this rocky environment. Not quite such a widespread distribution if you think about some of the other species. So more confined, has somewhat of a distribution in the more arid west, and then stretching sort of right the way up the east. So going through the whole of Zimbabwe, the northern parts of South Africa's sort of Kruger National Park, and then all the way up through Zambia and up into East Africa. So then if we just think about a slightly larger species of antelope, the first one that I've given here is actually South Africa's national antelope, known as a springbok, and quite literally translates as a jumping antelope. And the photograph on the right side there that shows this rather unusual posture is really very classic of springbok. So what it's doing there is something called pronking or stotting, where they lift all four of their feet off the ground at the same time. They can jump to quite significant heights by doing this. And then they also have this sort of flap of fur on their back, which they can then expose when they're doing this sort of behavior. It's an antelope of relatively open grassland type environments. Both males and females have horns. The females are much smaller and weaker. Um, Again, possibly used for defense from predation, but not used in male-to-male combat, as the ones in the males obviously are for females, and or territories. So they have these much stronger horns than the females do. So they are very much an arid adapted species. So they do very well in the more arid western portion of southern Africa. They used to be really quite widely spread throughout South Africa in the early parts of the 19th century. There's a number of books written about it when they had these enormous herds, which are described as going through areas for days. They were known as the trekbokken. Those no longer happen, unfortunately. The species are much more isolated in pockets now, but nonetheless, a really beautiful antelope. And this just shows you, like I said, it's more of an arid adapted species. So something that you're getting much more on the western side of southern Africa, which historically is more arid than the east, which is a generally more moist environment. You've got the Mozambican current going up the east coast, which brings more rainfall to the east, whereas you've got a much drier western coastline. So impala are probably one of the most ubiquitous of antelopes. And I think because they are so incredibly common, they are often very much overlooked. But they really are very beautiful antelope. And they also form a large portion of many predators' diets. So everything from leopard to cheetah, even lions will take them. So really a critical part of an ecosystem. So when you look at impalas, they also have this very unique gland on their feet. It looks like they're wearing little black socks on their back, on their hind legs. And that actually contains a gland, which when they are fleeing from predators, they kick up their back legs and release a pheromone, which the understanding generally is that it allows them, if they've all become scattered, that once the threat is past, it allows them to find each other in order to regroup. We see these in large numbers in pretty much all of our parks in southern Africa. Again, males bearing horns, females don't. The males have a really quite intricate rutting season, which starts in our autumn around about May. And the males start chasing each other around, making incredibly strange and very loud sounds for such a small antelope. And then herding females, so creating these harems, which they maintain for the duration of the breeding season. Once the breeding season is over, the herds actually go back to being mixed herds again, so males, females, pretty much living together. And the impalas are so incredibly successful. One of their success strategy or reasons they're successful is the strategy of dropping all their lambs pretty much within a 3-week period. So around about late November, early December, you'll have all the lambs, all the impala lambs dropping. And it's really a system of, you could call it flooding the market. So you know that you're a high prey species. Everything is wanting to eat you. So if you drop all your lambs at once, there's going to be a surfeit. So they can't eat absolutely all of the lambs that are born, and so your populations are still going to grow. And so it's quite an effective strategy when you look at the number of impala that there are in areas compared to other antelope species. They're also what we would call a mixed feeder, so they can eat both browse and graze. And so that, again, by having that diversification of food sources, also helps, particularly during things like very dry seasons, when grass becomes either very scarce or very nutrient poor. You can then switch your feeding strategy to something that is perhaps more abundant and perhaps still has a little bit more nutritive value associated with it than just eating dried out grass. So yeah, very widespread, very, as I said, very common, but nonetheless a really, really beautiful antelope. Another medium-sized antelope, and this one belonging to a group of antelope known as the trigalaphines, or the spiral-horned antelope. It's the smallest of the spiral-horned antelope, little bushbuck. And as its name suggests, it's more of an animal of thickets. So whereas impala will inhabit open areas and slightly thicker areas, springbok requiring large open areas, klipspringers, rocky areas. The habitat preferred by bushbuck is sort of denser, slightly more wooded areas, and largely moister areas rather than very dry areas. They have these beautiful little spots on them, sort of markings, and they also will eat a variety of different foods. Again, we had some in camp where I was staying on this latest South Africa safari, and the sausage pod trees were dropping all of their flowers, and these little guys were going around like hoovers, eating these as much as they possibly could. So quite shy antelope. You don't actually see them that often, but yeah, very pretty antelope. Males again have horns, the females do not, and actually the horns are incredibly sharp. So these little animals, although they look really quite sweet, are actually pretty ferocious from a territorial defense perspective. It's not something that should be taken lightly. In wide distribution, but as you can see, missing from the arid western portion of the subcontinent, but stretching right up into the more forested areas up in Central Africa. And then large antelope. So now we're going on to some of the other spiral-horned antelope. So this is an antelope known as an inyala, and really an antelope with very interesting extent of sexual dimorphism. So by that, I mean very different size and look characteristics, if you will, between males and females. So the males become this beautiful chocolate brown color with sort of yellow socks and these intricate face markings, and also these beautiful spiral horns. Up until about 14 months of age, when they reach sexual maturity, the males and females look almost identical. You can't tell them apart. And then as the males mature sexually, they then start to change color and to develop these horns. And it's really quite interesting because they have a number of quite intricate processes in terms of determining who breeding rights with females. They do this quite elaborate dance. So the males will stand sort of head to tail and do this very slow, strange, stiff-legged walk, which is a dominance display. And so, yeah, have this quite elaborate ornamentation. And I guess if you were to think about an equivalent in the bird world, you could think of birds of paradise, you know, where they have this incredible coloration or ornamentation in terms of attracting females and also just from, you know, a dominance kind of scenario. The females always remain this beautiful caramel color. They have these stripes on them as well as some little dots. And yeah, again, mainly mixed feeders, so they will eat some grass, but a lot of browse. Also inhabit areas in the more moist east. And one of the things that we find is where you have smaller antelope in these environments, especially things like bushbuck, Sunni as well sometimes, but when you have large concentrations of something like an inyala that is eating a particular food source and living in a specific habitat, this animal often outcompetes the smaller bushbuck in areas where both occur. And I've seen this on the reserve where I'm based when I'm not guiding, that we have very large numbers of inyala and hardly any bushbuck. And so it's largely a situation where they're just bigger and more dominant, and so they proliferate more than bushbuck do. This was just another picture of a very handsome male. You can see this sort of crest on his back, and then they'll do this elaborate posturing when they do their sort of male on male dominance displays. And if you look at their distribution, very much it's narrow distribution occurring in the moist east portions of South Africa into Mozambique, and then right up in the top of the Zambezi Valley in Zimbabwe, and going across again into sort of that northern area of Mozambique, but absent from pretty much everywhere that is dry. So quite a narrow distribution. Another antelope that I think quite a lot of people may be familiar with is a kudu antelope. So these quite a large antelope, another member of the spiral horned or trigalaphines. This one has only stripes on its body. So bushbuck mainly dots. Inyala have both spots and stripes, and kudu simply have stripes. And although it's not evident in these pictures, but these animals live in quite densely wooded areas. It's their preferred habitat. And the markings on them are known as disruptive markings or disruptive coloration. And what it does is that if you're looking at a solid object, a solid color in between branches, it actually stands out. Whereas if it now has this sort of mottled effect, it is a form of camouflage. And they use this to quite good effect in the environments in which they find themselves. The males have horns, the females do not. Both have these incredibly huge ears, and you'll watch them when they are listening. They twitch these ears constantly, trying to pick up on noises in this kind of thick habitat in which they live. Primarily browsers. So yeah, which goes with their living in these sort of more thickly wooded environments. This male was quite interesting. He was almost sort of horning the sand. There was a group of males. This was in the Sand River in the Sabi Sands, and almost looked like it was some sort of dominance display, but he didn't do it for very long, and then he carried on moving. These horns are incredibly heavy, and these males, when you actually watch them sort of running through the bush, they actually have to push their heads up and backwards to push those horns back along their back in order to get through the bush. It's quite an amazing sight to see when they do it. They have very white fluffy tails, which when they are fleeing, they will flick them up, and then at some point that white flash will disappear, and they'll freeze. And so again, most likely an anti-predation strategy. Following the white disappears. There's a chance that the predator might miss you. So this is just two males. So we spoke about horns being sort of male on male combat, and this is a typical example of it. These two young males, this was pretty much, I won't call it play fighting, but it was practice fighting. They weren't really locking horns, but this is something that would be typical of males competing for dominance. Just another photo of. And this is just showing their distribution. They talk about 3 subspecies, which we won't go into, but again, sort of a more easterly spread up through the most part of Africa, a little bit into Namibia. Waterbuck. So this photograph was actually taken at Mana Pools in Zimbabwe. And as their name suggests, they tend to occur in areas where it is more moist. This was quite an interesting interaction. This was a group of females and one young male, the young male with the horns. And this young male was fascinated by this warthog. I sat watching them for quite a long period of time, and this young waterbuck kept following this warthog around until eventually the warthog just decided he'd had enough and he left. But yeah, very interesting interaction. So the males bear these really beautiful recurved horns. The name waterbuck really refers to the fact that when they feel threatened, they flee into water. So they're not a species like red lechwe or sitatunga, which occur up in the sort of Okavango Delta, which really are much more adapted to living in wet environments. For these antelope, it's more of a case of when they are fleeing predation, they feel safer in water than they do on land. And they have this beautiful shaggy coat with a sort of with a very oily water repellent substance on it, which again is part and parcel of their sort of adaptation to being in these running into water. So two recognized subspecies, the one that we get in this portion of Southern Africa has a complete ring on its rear end, which this big white target, if you will, whereas the Defasa subspecies of more Central Africa sort of has just 2 semicircles, but otherwise very similar looking antelope. Another large species, a really, really beautiful antelope, sable antelope. So these are antelope of generally more dry areas. So this was taken in Hwange National Park on a Zimbabwe trip a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, they have these very, very elaborate horns, and yeah, are really they're quite aggressive antelope. And you can see here, I think this was two males who were kind of sizing up against each other. So distribution primarily sort of further up into the northern portion of South Africa and then all across Zimbabwe, Zambia. They really have become quite an elusive species to find, and it's one of the beautiful sights, if you will, to see herds of them in places like Wangi National Park. It's not an antelope, unfortunately. We see that often in South Africa. The same goes for roan antelope, which look quite similar in many ways. They just happen to have these absolutely enormous ears. It's one of the largest antelope species we have. So only eland in southern Africa are bigger than roan. And again, they have these beautiful recurved horns and somewhat elusive as well. Found in areas very similar to sable, and yeah, something that we see primarily from a safari perspective, we see when we go either into Zambia or into northern parts of Zimbabwe. And then the last one of these antelope for today is the common eland. So these are really, really large antelope, largest of our antelope species. Males have this very elaborate sort of dewlap that you can see on this antelope, and incredibly shy, but form these really big herds. In certain areas, you know, you'll get a herd of 100 or more of them, but they don't generally stand still for particularly long periods of time to have their photograph taken. One of the interesting things about them is when you hear them walking, they have this very pronounced clicking sound. And the most plausible explanation is that they're obviously quite heavy antelope, and the splaying of their hooves as they walk, and then kind of as they release the weight, you get the two toes, if you will, clicking back together, give you this very characteristic clicking sound. Despite their large size, they are also incredibly good jumpers. I mean, I've seen these antelope actually clear probably, I don't know, a 6-foot fence. So yeah, despite their really large size, quite agile antelope. This photograph was just quite useful for size comparison. So this was taken at Mana Pools in Zimbabwe. You can see the eland, and then obviously the one below it, quite a large male impala. What's quite interesting on this photograph, you can actually see you can see those sort of black socks I was speaking about earlier on the impala, which are where the glands are that allow them to sort of emit a pheromone to communicate with each other. And these ones are just slightly, so there's quite a lot of color variation across the subregion. This photograph was taken at Marataba in South Africa on a recent trip. So these are sort of a more golden brown, as opposed to the sort of gray color of the one in the previous photographs. And then this is just a distribution, quite widely spread throughout the subregion, but largely missing again from the sort of coastal portion, so entirely absent from the Namib, which is the grey portion on the west coast there, and a little bit of a spread up into East Africa, but not particularly far up into East Africa. And so that's really, from a presentation perspective, that's the end of the presentation. So Rob, back to you for any questions.
All right, thank you, Lorraine. So if you do have some questions, feel free to submit them via the question field in your control panel. So let's dive into some of these questions while we still have a bit of time here. So on the sable antelopes, were those birds oxpeckers?
Yes, they were oxpeckers. Yes. So oxpeckers are associated with many antelope species. So the smallest antelope that will actually tolerate them is an impala. So on very small antelope like the steenbok we saw and the Great Acres, they won't tolerate oxpeckers on them. Oxpeckers have incredibly sharp nails, and it seems that the smaller antelope species are just, yeah, are not interested in having them on them. But both species of oxpecker, yellow-billed and red-billed, will go on to most antelope species.
Great, thank you for that. Um, so is it true that the sable antelopes have sort of an amazing conservation story? Do you know anything about them coming back from the brink of extinction?
So um, I do know that there is quite a large industry involved in breeding sable antelope. Um, I don't know a great deal about sort of an extinction or bringing them back from the brink of extinction. I'd have to look into that more, Rob. I don't really know, but I do know that their numbers are not particularly high, and that much of the population that we have, certainly in South Africa at this point, is largely more associated with um, breeding facilities as opposed to sort of um, national parks, for example. But I'd have to look into it more for you.
Gotcha, no problem. Thank you, Lorraine. So are the kudu, are they more related to bison than antelope?
Um, no, so kudu are a an antelope. If I go right the way back, let's just go all the way back here. Sorry, I'll just go right back to the beginning. There we go. So if you have a look here, um, kudus fall also into this kind of trigalaphene group along with inyalas. So bison and buffalo are relatively closely related, but essentially um, in a different subgroup of bovid. So more closely related to each other than, for example, kudu are related to sable, um, but not that closely related if you look at this diagram.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. So we had a guest who was in Chad recently and saw Nyala. Is that unusual? And do you know if climate change is affecting their movement or range?
Saw an Inyala in Chad. Um, I don't know enough about kind of that portion, so going much further north in Africa. Um, Look, I think the reality is that as climate does change, ranges will change. But I would be lying if I said I knew that was within their natural distribution. Um, but I mean, it's certainly possible. If you think about the fact that um, there'll be moist sort of tropical areas up there as well. But they're definitely a species of moist environments. So, but yeah, exactly in Chad, I don't know whether it's something that you would see regularly.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. I appreciate that, Lorraine. Well, unfortunately, that is going to be the last question that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have for us.
Yeah, thanks. Just to say thanks again, Rob, and I will have a look into those two questions about sable and the Inyalas, and then I'll drop you an email with anything that I manage to find. But thanks again for the opportunity to present, and yeah, hopefully some people will come to Southern Africa to see some of our antelope species.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Lorraine. And in the words of our guest, Richard, this was a remarkably helpful webinar. So thank you so much for taking the time to present it for us today. And well, I also like to thank everyone who joined us today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at 800-543-8917, or you could send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We will see you next time.